The Shackleton Expedition is one of the world's greatest stories of human endurance. For literal years, Shackleton and his crew survived in one of the world's most dangerous and inhospitable places before they were finally rescued. And credit where credit's due, Shackleton was great, but he couldn't have done it without his loyal second-in-command, Frank Wild, a Yorkshireman. And I thought, oh, well, this is a cracking story to make a video about, so I'm going to be telling you the story of the Shackleton Expedition, but through the eyes of Frank Wild. So, let's look at this part of Yorkshire's hidden history. Churches, banners, kings and queens, factories and big machines, castles, forts and in-betweens are stories that I told. But first, I need to set the scene. This was a golden era for polar exploration. In 1909, the American Robert Peary had become the first to go to the North Pole, although some dispute this. In 1911, the Norwegian Roald Amundsen had beaten the English Robert Scott to go to the South Pole, and so it was an incredibly exciting time to be a polar explorer. For the Irishman Ernest Shackleton, who was already a bit of a celebrity, there was only one great prize left: to become the first to cross Antarctica, and so that was his goal. Shackleton chose Frank Wild as his second-in-command, who was born in Skelton in Cleveland in North Yorkshire. Those two went way back. They had both been with Robert Scott on his 1901 expedition, and Wild was second-in-command to Shackleton on his 1908 expedition. In fact, Wild just had a way of getting around on all the expeditions. He had even joined the Australian Sir Douglas Mawson on his expedition. So Wild was an incredibly experienced explorer and sailor who was a valuable asset to any expedition. And in fact, he claimed to be a direct descendant of the other great Yorkshire explorer, Captain Cook. As Alfred Lansing describes in his fantastic book on the expedition, Wild was a soft-spoken and easygoing individual on the surface, but he had a kind of inner toughness. Shackleton had developed a tremendous respect and personal liking for him. The aptly named ship Endurance sailed from Plymouth in August 1914, overshadowed by that other world event going on at the same time. Almost 4 months later, they entered Antarctica and encountered pack ice. There was more there than they'd been expecting, and it was extremely frustrating as the ice would trap the ship and halt all movement for days at a time. Progress was extremely slow, and in January 1915, 5 months after leaving England, the ship became totally stuck in the ice. We often forget the sheer power of ice. I mean, just look at the Titanic. But the Endurance was a purpose-built ship, designed by one of the greatest shipbuilders in the world at the time, and probably the strongest wooden ship ever built. And yet it was rendered hopeless and motionless by the ice. With no way of breaking the ice by themselves, they decided to just wait it out and float along with the ice. If you think the lockdown's been boring, try waiting for months on end on a ship trapped in the Antarctic. Although they did have lots of food supplies, it always needed topping up with hunting, and it was usually Frank Wild's job to go out and kill seals, which, let's be honest, wouldn't taste very nice, especially when mixed with blubber. However, at this time, the ship was slowly being crushed and trapped between the ice like a vice, and at one point the ice actually broke through into the ship. At this point, Shackleton had to make the difficult decision to abandon ship, and so on October 1915, 14 months after they had first sailed from England and 9 months since they had become trapped in the ice, they had to abandon the Endurance and make camp on the ice. This meant that their main goal was now impossible. They could no longer cross the Antarctic. They had to focus on survival and getting home. This was made worse by the fact that the radios they had at the time were incredibly primitive and they had no contact with any civilization. They were totally alone. They began going back into the ship to retrieve supplies, and when Wild and another man went in, it was in darkness, and the ship was being slowly crushed, and there was this incredible fear that it would just snap at any minute and they'd be trapped inside this crushed and sinking ship. But they managed to get what they wanted and get back out, and just an hour later, the ship sank, on November 21st, 1915. For the next 5 months they lived on the ice, slowly drifting north and waiting for the ice to break up enough to launch the lifeboats which they had taken from the ship. Their aim was to reach Paulet Island, which Shackleton knew contained food supplies, as he had purchased them and put them there 12 years earlier as part of a rescue mission for another expedition. During this time, as one man was returning from a hunting trip, he was suddenly set upon by a leopard seal. 12 foot long, weighing over 1,000 pounds and with sharp teeth, it burst out of the ice and chased him as he ran. He could have died had Frank Wild not shot it just in time with a hunting rifle. But supplies were running out, and in January 1916, Shackleton ordered that all the dogs and animals be shot. This is because they were simply eating too much meat, and naturally the job fell to Frank Wild. It must have been extremely traumatic, as the men had built up such a relationship with these dogs, these hard-working and lovable animals, and he had to take them out one by one, look into their eyes, and then shoot them. Because of the way the ice floes had drifted, they were now too north to reach Paulet Island, and so decided instead to try and reach Elephant Island. However, this could only be reached by a perilous lifeboat journey. In April, the floe which they had camped on was suddenly split, and they all soon clambered onto the 3 lifeboats and sailed for Elephant Island. It was now 20 months since they had first set sail. Shackleton knew that if they wanted to get out of this thing alive, they had to go get help themselves. No one was going to come and get them. So he decided to take 5 men and go in a perilous 800-mile trip by boat to South Georgia, where there was a whaling station. Now, this story is quite famous. These 6 men cramped together on this tiny boat, lashed by wind and rain and ice, thrown about on the ocean where they could die at any minute. But what I find is equally scary is the job of Frank Wild. Because as much as he wanted to be on the boat, he was ordered to stay behind on Elephant Island with the 21 other men and wait. Now, think about that for a minute. You've got no way of contacting Shackleton. You don't know if he's alive or dead, whether he's reached Georgia Island yet. All you can do is wait day by day by day in the hope that at some point you'll see his ship return. But you've got no way of knowing. And this is the only hope for them. Imagine the pressure that's putting on Frank Wild. He's got to keep his men together, keep their morale high, keep giving them jobs to do, and waiting each day in the hope that Shackleton has managed to pull off this quite dangerous feat. That tests a lot of character. Anyway, it took 2 weeks for Shackleton to reach Georgia Island, and then there was a 36-hour non-stop march to the whaling station. They had finally reached human civilization. But the waiting for Frank Wild and the rest on Elephant Island wasn't over yet. They still had to wait months. As one of the 21 men on Elephant Island would later describe, their morale and survival had been kept up through the leadership of Frank Wild and his buoyant optimism, dogged determination, unrivalled experience and calm demeanour, which had pulled us through these trying months of waiting. Finally, in August 1916, 2 years since they had first left England, and 5 months since Shackleton had first left Elephant Island, the rescue ship arrived. Imagine the relief you'd feel after 5 months of uncertain waiting. The food supplies had dwindled. There were very few penguins or seals there to hunt. Most people thought they were going to starve to death, but here, finally, coming over the horizon was Shackleton in the ship, rescuing you. That's the end of the story of the Shackleton Expedition, but there were more adventures for Frank Wild, including stints in South Africa and even in the Allied intervention in Russia during the First World War, but that's another story. Wild would join Shackleton for another expedition in 1921, but tragically, Shackleton died of a heart attack whilst at South Georgia. So what should we think of Frank Wild then? Well, he was this incredibly brave and reliable person who had the grit, resilience and determination to lead his men in their darkest and most perilous times to ensure that they all survived and that the whole expedition could return home. And I think that makes him one of Yorkshire's heroes. So that's all I've got time for today. I hope you've enjoyed this video and I hope you've learnt something new.